Good morning, students. Last class we have covered what is data, how many types of data are there, how is data organized, what are the different data processing systems, and the different types of file organizations. Today, as we have come to know what is all file organizations all about, how many types of file can be organized, the way it can be organized. First, now we'll discuss about the file oriented approach, why we have shifted to the new approach, and what are the hindrances which we have faced in the file oriented approach, for which we have adopted a new approach. Now, file oriented approach means our traditional system of files. When computers were first used for business applications, you see, a group of records was stored in a file. Then what happened in file oriented data processing, each department had its own files that were meant or designed specifically for those applications. Now, suppose there are three departments: academic department, library department, accounts department. Now, each of these departments will maintain a student's personal file, and in addition to this, the file which is necessary for their own application. Own application means for their own departmental application. Therefore, each application has a separate master file, the file which separate master file, and its own set of personal files. Now, these types of files will be maintained for each application, and that will include the following. What are the following types of files? Following means there could be a transaction file, a master file, an output file, a backup file. Now, why it is required? Why there are so many types of file? Transaction file means, in the last file oriented approach we had seen the different types of organization. When we first in first out concept in a sequential file, whatever we write it once. Now, after storing all the records, if you want to update or add any record or change any record or delete any record, we need to create another file where we carry out these transactions, and those updated things we write into the new file. That is called a transaction file. So, transaction file is actually a temporary file which will store the data to be processed. Now, once this data is processed, it is permanently stored in the master file. So, master file is actually your main file. So, more specifically, we can say the transaction file is used to update the master file. For example, suppose you take the case a payroll application. The transaction file will be used to calculate the monthly salary of each employee, and for that it will contain data about number of hours worked, overtime done by the employee, and other details about each employee. So, that is how the file is, or the data which is required is stored or put in over there to carry out the necessary tasks. Now, master file. What is a master file? A master file contains all the data, relevant data for an application. For example, in case of same payroll application, the master file permanently stores details of each employee such as name, address, pay scale, etc. The transaction file will calculate the current month's salary of each employee and update it in the master file to maintain a permanent record. Now, the third file, that is an output file. When working with multiple programs for data processing, the output of one program may be required as an input of another program. Hence, the first program stores its output in an output file which can be used by other programs. So, this is about output file. Another type of file is required known as backup file. It is in case of emergency, we always refer to this file called backup file. Like you see in computer, we always keep backups in case of drives. Suppose you have stored a file somewhere, you have also stored in another location. That is a backup. Where you are working, sometimes if it gets corrupted or some data has lost, you always refer to the backup location or backup file where you have stored in a separate place. Similarly, backup file, we can say it is a copy of the file which the system keeps as a precautionary measure against any loss of data due to inadvertent deletion. Then original file can be restored from the backup file. So you see, the traditional file approach, for one sort of application we need 4 different kinds of file. One is called the transaction file, one is master file, one is output file, and one is backup file. So for similar, if you have 4 applications, you need 4 4s are 16 such files. So you see, the amount of storage, amount of processing, the amount of memory it requires is quite large. So as because these are all characteristics of a file oriented approach, but these are actually, in a way, these are disadvantage also. That is why a new approach has come up, which most of the places, organizations, we are adopting that method. It is called a database approach. Now what is a database approach? Now initially when we talked about data, we had discussed how a database is formed. A database is formed by the collection of data which is stored in as records. Then from records a file is formed, and then a collection of files is known as a database. So what is the specialty of this database approach? That we'll see. First of all, we'll deal in brief. Later on, as and on we progress with the other topics and subtopics, we'll discuss the details about this database approach. So initially what we say, a database is a collection of the related data organized in a way that allows users to easily access, update and maintain the data. It stores all the non-redundant data that can be shared by different application systems. This means that only a single copy of data will exist in the entire system. Non-redundancy ensures data consistency. What is non-redundancy? Redundant, first you understand meaning of redundancy. Redundancy means duplicacy. Non-redundancy means where there is no duplicacy of data. So if there is no duplicate data, that means your data is consistent. That means same throughout. Data is not inconsistent. Inconsistent means same data somewhere is stored in one manner, in another place that particular data is stored in another way. So that leads to data inconsistency. But if you are having non-redundant data, that means non-duplicate data, it will ensure that you have data consistency. For example, if you see a scenario or a situation in which complete details of a student exist in files of 3 different departments, like one in accounts department, another one in the academic department, and third in the library. If there is any change in a student's address and he or she reports it to the academic department, only that particular department will have the right data. The correct data will conflict with other copies of data that are present in other departments. So that is a mismatch. That should not be. This is called inconsistent data. That means for one student somewhere data is something, in another place for that same student data is something else. So this will lead to inconsistent data, and that is why this occurred due to redundancy of data or existence of same data at multiple locations. This is why we see a database approach in which all the programs will access a single copy of data in the database. Apart from this, storing related data in an organized manner, a database also separates physical storage of data from application programs that access it. So this is called data independence. So we'll come to know about data independence again much larger. Independence means one data is not dependent on another data. That is called data independence. Here, in case of data independence, the programmer does not know the details of how the data is stored. These details are completely transparent to the users. Now, this is the reason why we are going to the database approach. Now, where this database is used and what are the applications, rather we should say applications of database system. Nowadays, database systems are almost widely used in most of the fields. As because it has plenty of advantages, database systems have been successfully implemented in various applications like They are used for ticket reservation system of flights and trains. Airlines and railways use them for displaying the route and schedule of trains and flights. They are also used in hospitals to store details of patients, their medical history, and any other details. Another example is like financial institutions like banks. They use them for managing the records of customers, accounts, loans, and other transactions. Banks and other financial institutions also use the databases to record purchases on credit cards for generating monthly bills. Apart from these, the database system is also used in schools and colleges to store information about students. In organizations, databases are used to maintain records of all employees, their salaries, perks, taxes, and for generating salary checks. Another example is telecommunication department, where databases are used to store information about the telephone numbers, record of calls, generating monthly bills, etc. So we have seen so many places or so many areas where database systems are used. Another current example is online shopping websites and their other business activities. They also use databases to store details of products, customers, transactions, and other payment details of the customers. Even the World Wide Web also maintain enormous amount of textual and multimedia data in databases. So again, in trading sector, they are used in online trading for storing information about sales and purchases of stocks and bonds. So we can see that the places where also you can think about any area, you find databases used. So what can we sum up about the advantages of it? There are plenty of advantages of database system if you compare with your normal traditional file system. For example, say the first point being, it helps in reduction of data redundancy. That means duplication of data is minimized because databases are rather shared than being used independently. So if one department is there or three departments are there, they'll all use the same database instead of each application program or each department using the database separately. So in that way, data redundancy is reduced. As because data redundancy is reduced, it minimizes data inconsistencies also. So one place one data is stored, and if that related record is stored in another department, same data will exist there also. So it becomes consistent. Next point, it maintains data integrity and quality. These are all actually related points. If it is consistent data, obviously the quality of data will be high and data will be integrated. So these are the points which are all connected with each other. Redundancy less means consistent data means good quality of data, and ultimately maintaining data integrity. Now, the information about the stored data, including its meaning and interpretation, can be saved in the data dictionary. So what is data dictionary? From the word you can understand, dictionary is a place you all know where you can find out the meanings of different words. Data dictionary, when we are talking about whatever data we are dealing in the database, all that are put into one place, which is termed as data dictionary. Data dictionary, you can also call it as metadata. Now what is metadata? Metadata is data about data. So that is called metadata, and that is what is stored in the form of data dictionary. Next, DBMS takes care of all the fundamental operations that results in reduced cost of software development. Now, the software development cost is minimized because DBMS takes care of all these fundamental or basic operations. Now, the data stored is secured. Secured means protected in the database, as it includes security tools to control access. Here we come to a point where here there is a concept called permission or access. Here suppose we are using one application, but there could be n number of users. N users may not have the same kind of permission. Now what is permission? In computer we have three kinds of permission. Permission is reading, writing, executing. Now some users might have read permission. They will not be able to execute any work in that file or write something into it. Some might have both read and write, so they can write some data into it as well as read it, but they cannot execute. And some users might have execution permission, which means they can execute some work on that file with the data. So there are various levels of permission. So this type of permission access is given in database, which is not possible in a different kinds of permission is not available in traditional file approach. Next, it is also easy to search the data by using keywords. With the help of keywords, we can easily search from the huge volume of data we have. For example, we have a query language in accessing might be learning that whenever we want to retrieve something, we give some criteria. Suppose, for example, if I tell you we have 100 students, I want students who reside in and around Tollygunge Metro or Tollygunge Station. So I can give this criteria and search out of 100 records, maybe only 5 students are there. So the work of database is to match this criteria, and it will selectively extract only those records which are matching that criteria. Similarly, other work also can be done by particularly applying a particular data using keywords. Data can be shared among multiple branches of the same organization. Data can be used to analyze various trends like which product is most popular among customers, customers are happy in buying which type of product, etc., etc. So these are the various advantages of a database system. So now if we sum up, now we have learned what is file oriented and what is database. Now if we want to lay down the differences between file oriented and database oriented approach, what do we say? The first point, data redundancy. In file oriented approach, if a particular data is required by 2 different applications, then it may be stored in 2 or more files. Like in a college, the details of a student may be stored in accounts, academic and library department. But data redundancy won't be there in case of database approach because it is shared by all the departments, so data will be consistent. But in case of file oriented approach, this is not feasible. Second point, program or data dependency. Now the major drawback of the file oriented approach of data processing is that programs are dependent on the files and files depend on data. Therefore, when there is a change in the physical format of the file, the program also had to be changed. Now if any, for example, in a situation where a new data field has to be added in the master file, then all programs that access the master file will have to be changed. So that's a cumbersome process. So the entire task has to be repeated again and it will take much effort and time. Whereas this problem is not there in case of a database oriented approach. Now third difference, lack of flexibility. Since the data and programs are strongly coupled means joined, most information retrieval requests would be predetermined, means beforehand it can be determined. Users will be allowed to generate only certain types of reports and execute only a limited number of queries. Such systems are capable of responding to unpredictable queries and some kind of trend analysis that has now become compulsory for any business to be present in the competitive world. Now the next advantage of database oriented approach, difficulty in accessing data. Now in file oriented approach, the data needed to retrieve in a convenient and efficient manner is very difficult. Suppose we want to make a list of all the customers who live within a particular postal area, then in a particular traditional file approach this would not have been possible. Just example which I have given you, if I want to suppose pin code 14, so I can give a criteria in database and based on this criteria whichever records are matching with this can be retrieved, but this is not the case in file oriented approach. So for each new request for information, either existing programs are modified or are written from scratch. So this is quite laborious and time taking, which is mostly removed in a database oriented approach. Next is data integrity issues. In case of data integrity issues, data stored in files must satisfy certain types of consistency constraints. For example, the student cannot issue more than 3 books. Developers enforce these constraints by adding appropriate code in the application programs. However, when new constraints have to be added, it is difficult to change the programs to enforce them. This problem becomes more complex when constraints involve several data items from different files. So these are not that cumbersome in case of a database approach. Security issues. Every user, just as I told you about the security problem, so the database doesn't have, or database allows the security problems to be handled very carefully. Every user should be able to access all the data. But suppose a librarian should not be allowed to access the salary of the teachers. So that permission will be restricted in case of a librarian. So that is being allowed in case of a database oriented approach. So which is normally difficult in a file oriented approach. But yet you see, all the systems has some advantages and few disadvantages. Here also there are very limited disadvantages also in case of a database. Like larger file size, that's one disadvantage of database. To support complex applications and functionalities, the DBMS is a big program that occupies a large amount of space on disk as well as in the internal memory. So this is one problem. Next disadvantage, increased complexity. A large number of complicated functions makes database processing a complex product. To efficiently work with databases, users must learn a lot so that to have a maximum potential out of it. Greater impact of failure. Now suppose if there is any failure caused, it will have a bigger impact on the files. So suppose several users share the same data. So if the system crashes, or if the main file centralized this database crashes, the entire system storing the data fails, then many users will be affected at the same point of time, because the data is shared and there is no multiple copies, so retrieval is also very difficult. The fourth disadvantage, difficulty in data recovery. Now suppose in case of any emergency or any catastrophe, recovering the data is not a easy job, because several users might be trying to update his data simultaneously. If the catastrophe has already occurred, the data is first restored to a previous state when it was last known to be correct. Then any updates regarding the data since that time is to be redone. The more number of users involved in updating the data, higher the complexity of updating the database. So these are the few disadvantages of a database approach. Although we have seen there are plenty of advantages of a database oriented approach, that is why the reason we have shifted from the traditional approach to the database approach. So we can see why we have moved from the normal file approach system to the database system. Now let's come to the concepts of database management system. First of all, there is a property called ACID property. Why this ACID property? This is an abbreviated word. All the letters signifies each new word. A means atomicity, C means consistent, I means isolation, and D means durability. Now, what these terms mean? What is atomicity? What is consistency? What is isolation? What is durability? So let's come to each of this one by one. In case of database approach, atomicity means when a transaction is performed, either all or none of its operation must be completed. No intermediate will happen, either all or none. This means when a transaction that is successfully completed must commit. Commit means saving. Make changes to the database permanent, and the one that failed should abort. Abort means undo or erase database changes. For example, suppose person A wants to send an online money transfer to person B. the transaction will consist of two operations. First of all, deducting amount from A's account. That means A's account will be credited and A's account will be debited rather, and B's account will be credited with that amount. So either both of these operations should be performed or none. So it cannot happen that A's account is debited and B's account not being credited. No, that is not a correct transaction, and that transaction will never be saved. It is cancelled. So either both the operations will take place or none of the operations. Now it is not a question of two operations. It could be three operations in one transaction. In that case, either the three or none. So irrespective of the number of transactions, the atomicity says either all operations must be completed or none of the operations would be completed. This is called atomicity. Now what is the second term meant for? Consistency. Consistency means each transaction must preserve the consistency of the database. We have talked about consistent, inconsistent. That means same throughout. This means that after the transaction is complete, the database should have the correct information. For example, if A's had 10,000 in his account, then after paying 1,000 to B, the balance must be 9,000 and no other figure. It cannot be 9,400, 9,100 or 9,002. No. If it is 1,000 been transacted to B's account, that means the amount deducted will be 1,000 and the balance will be now 9,000. So that is how the system works. So this is called consistency, means fixed or constant. That is called consistency. Next comes isolation. What is isolation? Isolation means each transaction must execute as if it were running all alone. That means it is not dependent on some other transaction. It is important to find out that the result of running a set of transactions is the same as running one transaction at a time. This is also called serializability and is implemented by locking the table. Example, same example if we consider, 1,000 has to be deducted from A's account and 3,000 has to be credited. Then irrespective of the amount, whether the amount is deducted first or added, the end result should be that the end of both the transactions, A's balance should be 12,000. That means 10,000 minus 1,000 plus 3,000. So either you are deducting first or adding later, or adding first and deduct later. Ultimately the amount should be same. That is called isolation. Now what is durability? The last word. Durability means that the committed transactions are permanently stored on a storage device. That means whatever you have done, if you have committed, commit here means saving. If you have committed, that means it needs to be saved permanently in any storage device. This is called durability. So what we have seen, acid property mean atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability. So a database must store only successful transaction, and any successful transaction will have this acid property, and these are the explanation of these properties. All together the abbreviated word is known as acid. So that is why we called acid property. Okay.